cause confusion. It wasn't to be intimidating. It was actually to give encouragement to the Israelites who were in captivity. Now, that's really important because we think typically of Daniel as this like end times heavy prophet. And then the other side of that would be Revelation. What's fascinating is Revelation has a very similar purpose. And again, Josh covered this really well last week, so we're not going to sit on it super long. But when you're looking at it, again, the author is God through John. The audience is persecuted Christians. And the reason, as Josh kind of touched on this, but it was to encourage the church by reminding them of Christ's return. And then sort of this undertone of motivation to be faithful to God and that he is in control even when things are at their worst. And ultimately, it is that point that God wins. And so there's an encouragement in that. And so as you're looking at it, there is these concepts of Christ's worthiness of worship, which is actually really neat. You'll see that today, how it'll go from to like a scene of worship, judgments to a scene of worship. And the book is constantly trying to pull your attention back to remind you who's really in control this whole time. And that control, obviously, as we kind of finished off last week, when nobody's worthy to break the seals, and then the Lamb, who's Jesus Christ, shows up, he is worthy to break the seals, which we'll get in that kind of in a minute. But when you're looking at Revelation, you're looking again at the end of the first century after decades of persecution from Nero, Titus and the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, and then you have Domitian, which is probably one of the worst persecutions as far as Christians are concerned, and just the violence against them in that first century. And you're bumping up on, again, we're in the 90s AD, and the whole point of this letter was to encourage the church by reminding them of Christ's return, that he is going to keep his promises, that it is worthy to be faithful to God because he is going to kind of fulfill those promises. And so again, if the letter was written to encourage, to help, to motivate, and to strengthen, why are people typically so afraid of or intimidated by studying Revelation? Instead of reading it with its purpose in mind, typically what we start to do is we read thinking that we need to fill in all the gaps, or at least find the gaps, fill them with some answers or reasoning, and then just have to make absolute perfect sense of all of it. And if you remember, Josh touched on this last week, but there is this idea that at some point you have to be okay with having gaps in your knowledge. And we say that, and I just say it with this sort of maybe preface, is like, it's almost like this, I'm not God, so I'm never going to know everything. We're never going to be God. We're never going to be like all-knowing because we're not God. And there is a sense with Revelation that when you're looking at it, and you'll see this as we'll go, a lot of what he's doing is just giving like a description of like what's going on, but he doesn't necessarily dive into every single nuance of how it plays out, of how this system comes. Like, he doesn't do that. Now, there's some description, like we say next week, he gives a little bit more information, but the whole point is sort of this overview, and we start going into it feeling like we just have to fill in every gap. We're not given every single detail and explanation about this time in human history, and so feeling like you have to, sometimes it can create intimidation when you forget the whole point of the letter was to be encouraging and motivating to Christians who were the ones reading it. Now, I don't know how, I say like memes, like how meme literate you are. I'm not very, I'm just pretending I am. But there is this one, it's like the expectation versus reality. So it would be like, the expectation is like, my cheeseburger from McDonald's looks like the commercial, which the first problem is you're at McDonald's getting a cheeseburger. But it looks beautiful and perfect. And then in real life, it's like this, so the expectation is perfect. The reality is, ew. So there's this one that is, the expectation is what I think I look like in Bible study. And I think in some extent, right, that you, when you're studying Revelation, to some extent it should look like this. Maybe not exactly. The chairs look a little weird. Actually, I just noticed that. Probably shouldn't have those. Maybe at like the twig, that they might fit in there. But when we go into Revelation, though, we have sort of this, it really ought to be an encouraging Bible study about Jesus, about worship, like Mendoza talked about last week. God's holy judgment of sin, the fulfillment of Christ's promises, his return, this ultimate victory, the establishment of the kingdom. But if you're not careful, you quickly turn into this guy. So that's what I think I look like, and this is what I'm actually like. It's the conspiracy theorist. I have to fill in every gap. I have to connect the dots. And this is kind of the image that we think of maybe if somebody's like, oh, I love Revelation. It's so interesting. You're like, okay, like you're definitely not this guy or girl. You're definitely that guy. Like that's kind of where our brains go with Revelation. And I just say, like, we can very quickly turn into someone that is essentially just a spiritual conspiracy theorist. And I ask the question, how do you go from slide 1 to slide 2? And it's actually really simple. It's just speculation. All you have to do is speculate, fill in gaps, process through your own reasoning, listen to people that are attaching current events to fulfillment of things, and very quickly you go from what's supposed to be an encouraging study about God's sovereignty and God's judgment of sin, and we say ultimately the fulfillment of his promises, to someone who is just stressed out. And I kind of just wrote this, that if your study of Revelation, if my study of Revelation causes stress and anxiety, I'm probably doing something wrong. God fulfilling his promises shouldn't be stressful, but it should motivate us to worship him because he is worthy of that worship. And so as we're kind of moving through this, we can build a sufficient understanding of the events, what happens, why it's all happening by simply staying faithful to the text and keeping a consistent hermeneutic throughout it. As Josh said last week, you're going to have to be okay at some point with having certain gaps in your knowledge when it comes to every little detail of what's going to happen. Now, I was going to do this, and it actually is great that Josh did it, just walking through these 4 main views. I'm not going to do it this week, but I am trying to be like full transparency. The highlighted section is where I'm coming from. So I recognize, and Josh did a great job of summarizing these last week of just, again, that brief overview of understanding. And I'm not going to go through them again because he did that already, but I do want to at least explain some, like from my perspective, sort of 3 main reasons why, after kind of going through a lot of this in my own life, why this is the conclusion that I've come to personally, and then why I'm teaching it from that perspective in the end. Number 1, I think that when you're looking at futurism, so again, that would be what Revelation is talking about is future literal events. So these are things that are actually going to happen. They just haven't happened yet, basically. 1, it does leave room for both literal and symbolic language as indicated by the context, which Josh talked about that last week a little bit. So would agree with that, obviously. The second one, though, and I think the next 2 are probably more critical for me personally. 1, or I guess it would be 2, but 2a or whatever, it is consistent with what Jesus and there's other passages in Scripture taught about end times in those various passages. So when you study like the Olivet Discourse, you can study what Paul says in 1 Thessalonians, even 1 Corinthians, Hebrews 10 as well. And then Peter, which we'll actually look at 2 Peter at the very end. But if you look at what Peter talked about in 2 Peter 3, when they talk about like future judgment and Christ's return and all that, they're talking about it like it's a literal event in the future. And so it matches that of what other, I say, people write in Scripture. And this is the other one that we'll look at briefly before we get into it. But the futurist view is the only interpretation that sufficiently answers the question of the unfulfilled portions of the covenants given to Israel by God himself. Now, we talked through these. This is my last lesson, 3 or 4 weeks ago now, so I'm not going to put it up long. But we talked about those covenants, the covenants made to Israel, were they conditional, unconditional? Again, I'm not going to go through all of it. But when you're looking at the elements of some of these, especially like the land Davidic and the Abrahamic covenants and those unconditional elements that hadn't been fulfilled, that whole premise, and this is the slide from Josh Bunger's, I think it was Ezekiel, I don't remember. But looking at these sort of promises, and I added a few from when we talked through the covenants. But if you're reading Revelation literally and how it relates to certain things, all of those clocks become green check marks. That's the simplest way I can explain it. So again, I'm not sitting on this super long, but that is just, Josh did a great job of summarizing those, so I'm not going to take time to do that. And again, when you go back to Daniel, we talked about that sequential, like the sequencing of how he lays things out. And I'm going to put this up on the screen. This is it's just a timeline that I put together based on how I'm approaching it this week and next week. Again, I realize the font is pretty small, so I try to get it bigger. But again, you are kind of looking at the sequence of like 6 to 11 is essentially covering right till the end. And then when you're looking at 12 to 18, it's doing a little bit of a rewind, but then you end up catching up right back where you were and getting to the end of the tribulation. And then 19 is that second coming, Armageddon. And then again, the end of 20 and 21 and 22. I think Bunger is covering those after we're done. But this is sort of, I'm just saying, a brief timeline. I'm not going to keep it up long because you won't be able to draw it unless you're incredibly fast. and have really good eyesight, because I realize some of those are short. As we're looking through the seals, I'll just explain this now. Seals 1 through 7, you can see get up to the abomination of desolation, and then the trumpets and the bowls are kind of the second half. I'll probably mention that as I'm going, but I want you to see that just as you're kind of understanding the way that I'm approaching it. So it's like I say, full transparency. This is kind of how I'm working through it. But I also did this, and I will not keep this one up long either. And this is where I'm saying, if you would like to look at it in more detail, just connect with me and I can email it to you. But I also did this and just tried to line up everything that we talked through Daniel. I took some of what we talked about through the Olivet Discourse with Matthew 24, and then obviously the Revelation is in there. And it's just lining up everything. And again, my point, although it's colorful and lots of lines, my point is just to say that when you're looking at it as future literal events, when you're looking at those key passages like the Olivet Discourse, Daniel, and then Revelation, they do all sort of do the same thing and moving sequentially. So like I said, I do have this as like an image file. So if you want to look at it, send me any critiques or questions. I would be more than happy to do that. But just for the sake of not trying to make you read tiny letter, we're going to keep moving forward. But as we go from there, what we're going to do this morning is focus on going chapter by chapter. So Josh covered us all the way up to chapter 5. And remember, 5 is this like worship scene in heaven. Everyone's like, who's worthy? No one's worthy, that like, the title deed to the universe. No one's worthy to break the seals. And then who shows up at the end that is worthy? It's Jesus, right? So Jesus shows up at the end of chapter 5. He takes the seal. He alone is worthy. And I just want to make sure we note this in the beginning in case I forget to say it as I'm going. From this point forward, the one initiating everything is Jesus. And it's a really important detail, because as you start seeing judgments and you start seeing things get ugly quick, you start, like, your brain starts to go like, whoa, that's intense. That would be a lot of people. Wow, that's a lot of fires. Like you start getting a little bit overwhelmed, but you have to remember Jesus is the one breaking the seals. He's the one in control of all of it. And he is doing this to fulfill the purpose of his promises that he's made. So we'll start in chapter 6. Remember, that ending is he has the seal. He's worthy. And what does he do in chapter 6? He breaks the seals. So you go verses 1 through 8. And what you find is, we say the infamous 4 horsemen, the 4 horses. And this actually, the imagery of the horses is tied to Zechariah chapter 1 and chapter 4. And again, what you're seeing is these horses and their riders are representative of forces. And I put it this way: these are the spiritual realities behind the literal fulfillment. We're not necessarily given the specific details of the events that occur from these horsemen, which we'll walk through in a minute. But it is just like a general, this is what it is, this is what happens, next this, next this, next this. And so what you have in the first horseman is verse 2, and I'll just read it. And I looked, behold, a white horse. He who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. And this is where I say this general overview, and people will go wild on that, but just what does it tell us about this sequence of the very beginning? It identifies someone rising to power, this force moving forward. A bow is the image of strength. You do know there's no arrows, so like he has a bow but no arrows. And it kind of gives you some clarification on the lack of violence or the lack of the need for arrows. It says that there is a crown of victory that is given to him. So his power, in a sense, he's given power as he's conquering and going out to conquer. And what you have is, early on in this tribulation period, there is a false world peace that occurs as a result of someone rising to power. Now, again, you can go to Daniel and you tie in some of like the little horn and all that stuff. And then again, I'm saying we'll dive actually more into that next week with the Antichrist, because 12, 13, and 14 give a little bit more information, not all of it. But again, something or someone, this power rises, and there's this fake sort of peace, this world peace. And I kind of, you say like every Miss America is just like world peace. It's like, woohoo, they're one, if you could do one thing, like of all the things. But anyways, they're all happy, whatever. But this whole thing is false. It's fraudulent peace. And you kind of are moving through this, and you go to verse 4. So this false peace of the whole world unifying together under this force. And then it says, it goes to the second seals, or I'm sorry, Yes, the second seal. So you have the first horse. The second seal is verse 4. And he says, another horse, fiery red, went out, and it was granted to the one who sat on it to take peace from the earth, and that people should kill one another, and there was given to him a great sword. So what you have is this massive global war, all that's being done in the name of basically keeping or preserving peace, but the whole point is we're removing peace to attack, to fight. And what you just have is a large scale, just calling it global lawlessness, is this death and violence. The fifth seal actually gives us a little bit of clarification on sort of what's happening during this time in tandem with this global conflict, but that's just this huge conflict, lots of violence throughout the whole world. And then the third seal, the black horse and this rider with scales. Third, so again, this is the breaking of the third seal, this black horse who's carrying a scale. And it's just this idea of a global famine. So the black horse is carrying the scales. Verse 6, I heard a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, a quart of wheat for a denarius and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine. And again, it's just this shortage. The food is really expensive or resources are just really short. Again, it's just there's this massive famine. That's what we're told. And then the last horse, this fourth seal, is this pale or green horse. And it's unique because it actually tells you who the rider is. And it says, I looked and there was a pale horse. This is verse 8. And he who sat him, the name of him who sat on it was Death, and Hades followed with him. And power was given to them over a fourth of the earth to kill with the sword, with hunger, with death, and by the beasts of the earth. And again, this whole image is you have a quarter of Earth's population passes away as a result of these wars, famines, diseases, and it even says wild beasts. And it's this imagery of even nature is just falling apart. And I think it's really important because this all starts with a false world peace, and it ends with just falling apart. You have this in the first half, and that's the first half of the tribulation. So that's where you see really immediately you're just given this really short overview of what happens and what's the conclusion. And I just wrote that peace that's not from God is never going to last. And this is sort of, in a sense, you could say humanity's like one more experience of seeking hope, and it all just falls apart in the end. And that's what you see. Now, you do have a lot of people that will make the mistake of attributing like current events to these horses. And I started to list them, and I was like, I'm not doing that because it's too long, unfortunately. These events, again, are worse than anything that's ever happened in human history. And I just want to remind you, remember that Jesus is the one breaking the seals. He's in complete control. He's doing this. He's allowing this. It's not like he's going, all right, for 3.5 years, I'm going to go let the world fall apart. Okay, halfway point. All right, I'm back. Like that's not how it's working. He's in control the whole time, and that is supposed to be encouraging. Now, we say all that, and we get to the fifth seal. Now, at face value, the fifth seal, where what you're seeing is this basic, let me just read it, trying to describe it. When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. And they cried out with a loud voice, saying, how long, O Lord, holy and true one, until you judge and avenge our blood to those who dwell on the earth? And then it just says, it was said to them that they should rest a little while longer until both the number of their fellow servants and their brethren who would be killed as they were was completed. Now, at face value, you're going, oh, like that, those are martyrs. Those are people that have been killed for their faithfulness to God. But I step back and say, well, isn't that's an indication of people being redeemed during the tribulation, that there is a sense of people seeing what's happening, God being in control, and being drawn to Christ through salvation. Now, there's more demonstrations or explanations of this as we're moving, but these are people, and it says, who have been killed for their faithfulness to God in the context of what you just read of what's been happening. And then you get to the sixth seal, and again, this is tied to Joel 2:28 through 32. Just because of time, I'm not going to read it, but that's a really important cross-reference that actually talking about end times, being redeemed within that context. So it is just a really neat, and again, you're getting this worship scene of martyrs seeking for, like, how much longer is this going to go on? And there's a reward, they're in heaven. But again, it's tied to this faithfulness to God through everything that's happened. So yes, people are being saved during this time, but also being martyred for it. And that's what you see in the second part of verse 9. And then you get to the sixth seal. God breaks the seal, or Christ, again, well, same thing, but Jesus breaks the seal. And then look at verse 16 and 17 of chapter 6. Where is it? There we go. And said, yes. And the kings, I'm sorry, it should be 15. The kings of the earth and great men, the rich men, the commanders, the mighty men, every slave and every free man hid themselves in the caves and in the rocks, and said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from who? From the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath has come, and who is able to stand? This would mark the abomination of desolation. And I say, we'll tie this into next week. But this does happen within tandem of the Antichrist sort of establishing himself as a worship God. And again, we're going to get into that next week. But there is this sense of God reveals himself, that the whole world knows God is the one, that Jesus is the one doing this, that they're seeing him sitting at the throne. He's the wrath of the Lamb, talking about Christ. The whole world knows, and I just wrote it this way. Basically, the world is without excuse from this point moving forward. Whatever excuse they may have had up until this point, but it is another reminder that God is doing and allowing all of this, and now the whole world is without excuse, knowing that he is the one doing all of this. And again, this is sort of happening as well with stuff that we'll talk about next week. Later on. So we go to the next slide, chapter 7, and this is where we go, okay, that was kind of an intense chapter. That was a lot for one chapter. But what's really beautiful about chapter 7 is you are getting this imagery of God's sealing, God's protection of his people, this faithful remnant that Scripture has talked about. And so if you look at verses 2 through 4 of chapter 7, it says, Then I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God. And he cried with a loud voice to the four angels to whom it was granted to harm the earth and the sea, saying, Do not harm the earth, the sea, or the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads. Now it goes forward to talk about the 144,000 that are sealed, and it says Israel. And then the second half, verses 9 to the end of the chapter, verse 17, I believe, talks about and it says in verse 9, if you're looking at it, there was a great multitude which no one could number of all nation, tribes, peoples, and tongues, standing before the throne and the Lamb, clothed in white. And then again, it just describes another worship scene of people in heaven worshiping Christ. And so you have these, we say two groups, but you have Israel being sealed, and then you have the redeemed multitude worshiping in heaven. And again, just looking at it, this faithful remnant of Israel who do not bow the knee to the Antichrist. And then again, I'm just tying this in. We're not necessarily talking about all of Israel, but it does seem to be isolating people who do bow the knee to Christ, who do repent and get right with Christ, maybe as a result of what they've seen. But again, we're not going to fill in gaps, but we're just saying, hey, at this point, there are Israelites that are repenting and getting right with God. And then in the second half, you do have another group described from every tribe, tongue, and nation that are in heaven worshiping God as well. And so it's just a really neat when you're talking about like Ephesians 2 or even Romans 9, 10, and 11, some of these just simple fulfillments of God redeeming his people, those who are willing to bow the knee. And actually some of this is going to come back up as we get into the trumpet judgments, that it does talk about some of these judgments don't affect God's people, or there's at least a sense of protection on this second half. And so he even says that in the beginning of the chapter. It's almost like, hold up, let me seal mine, and then we can move forward, is sort of maybe, hopefully it's not an oversimplification, but that is what he says in the beginning of the chapter. It's like, stop, sealed, and again, worship scene in heaven. So you're getting back to this like worship. Don't forget, worship, God's in control, worship. And then you go into the next phase of judgment. Now, what you have at the breaking of the seventh seal is this sort of transition into the seven trumpets out of the seventh seal. And what we'll find, we'll talk about the seven bowl judgments next week. But the 7 trumpet judgments contain the 7 bowl judgments. So once you get to the 7th trumpet, it goes into the next phase. But they all are connected in sort of that sequence. So just to give you an overview or a summary, and I'll just say this now, my plan is to end at like 45 hard. Like that's I do want to make sure I leave time for questions. So if I'm covering something too quickly, or I am going to leave time for questions. So that's why I'm going to start moving a little bit quicker, because I do think that's important if you need clarification or whatever. So we will leave time for that. But just to go quickly through the first 6 judgments. So you have chapter 7, and then chapters 8 and 9 are kind of what are getting into these 7 trumpets. Now, I say I'm just going to, for the sake of time, just trying to give you a brief overview, or at least a summary of what we're trying to walk through. But as the 7th seal is broken, it contains these 7 trumpet judgments. And these are essentially the kicking off of the second half of the tribulation. And so when you're going through the trumpets 1, 2, 3, and 4, you do have an emphasis on these natural judgments. The first one is you find a result of the trees in the forest being burned. It talks about fire and hail being rained down. The second seal is this like something the size of a mountain lands in the seas, and then it just these sort of results that come as a result of that, I should say, sorry. And it just says 1/3 of the seas are turned to blood. Talks about 1/3 of the ships being destroyed, 1/3 of the sea creatures being killed. So that's just 1/3 of the seas, kind of giving you a synopsis there. 3, 1/3 of the water sources are poisoned. So again, it just talks about like freshwater sources all become poisoned to whatever are unusable. And then the 4th seal is 1/3 of the sun and moon are altered. And again, when you're getting, okay, it's natural, again, getting into science and, the moon and the effects that it has on nature and tides and all that stuff. Again, I'm not going to get into all the details, but again, I'm just as an explanation of what you're seeing, these natural judgments. And then you have the supernatural. That's the demonic swarms that torment mankind for 5 months is the 5th seal. And then the 6th seal is these 4 demons that are released out of, it says the Euphrates River, the bottomless pit, that whole category of things. And it just says that they are given authority basically to kill 1/3 of mankind. Now, I realize I'm summarizing it, and I'm adding a little bit of a side note to it, maybe like a personal side note. Some of the issue that I have with looking at this and saying, I used to read a lot of guys, and like their comment about this is, well, there's no way this could be literal. And it's interesting because those same commentators, if you go to like the judgments on Egypt, which a lot of them, they're not saying exactly the same, but there's a lot of similarities. They'll say those are literal. And I just have a problem with that, to say that it's absolutely ridiculous to believe that these are metaphorical or literal, but then to say God could use natural things to judge the world here, but out here, there's no way. Again, I'm coming from my personal perspective, but I just think I just don't understand how you could come to 2 different conclusions in looking at that. I realize there's different processes to look through it, but as you're looking through this, it's not unlike anything that's happened before in the context of, when you're looking at Egypt and other things. And so, I think when you're looking at like this, something lands in the ocean and destroys 1/3 of ships, if you just read it, it kind of makes sense. But if you go at, the ships can't be ships, the sea creatures can't be creatures, the sea can't be sea, it seems like you're starting to muddy waters. And again, I realize my perspective, but when you're looking at it, it all just seems to flow of what is happening. And even the supernatural. Again, I would make the argument, Ephesians 6:12, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, rulers of darkness, and wicked spiritual hosts. I don't think these demonic swarms are helicopters. It doesn't say that. But one, it does seem to be describing this time of very specific judgment where these very specific creatures are released for a time of judgment. And they're just tormenting mankind, and then the demons that are released again as part of this judgment. And this is kind of 8 and 9. This is where it like gets really intense, especially when you dip into like the supernatural things that are happening. But I go back to this. Remember, God's in control the whole time. He's doing this for a purpose and working things to that planned end. And then you get to 9, I missed one slide. So you see that severe demonic persecution that's going on. And then if you look at chapter 9, verse 4, it's fascinating because as this is happening, it says that only those men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. And so, again, it is a parallel, but I'm just saying in the sense when you look at Egypt and there was a time where his people were protected from the plagues, you see a very similar thing here where those that are repentant of God are protected. Now, you might be thinking, well, wait a second, what about the ones who are being martyred? And I would say, so they die and go to heaven. You know, it's kind of the same thing we say now, is God is still saving and redeeming his people within that context. And so a lot of that it's encouraging and it's neat to see. But then you do have the question of how is the rest of the world responding to all of this? Because it hasn't really touched on it much, just giving you these overviews. Well, chapter 9, verses 20 and 21 give you some clarity on what people are thinking. The rest of mankind who were not killed by these plagues did not repent of the works of their hand, and this is really important, that they should not worship demons and idols of gold, silver, brass, stone, wood, which can neither see, hear, nor walk. And they did not repent of their murders, their sorceries, or their sexual immorality, or their thefts. Now, this is the key phrase I want you to lock in on. They did not repent of the work of their hands, that they should not worship demons. They are willfully not repenting to God because they want to keep doing what they're doing. And there is a tie into this demonic worship that, again, we're going to talk about next week. But this is where there are other things going on in this time frame, and people are seeing it and still choosing to follow Satan and the Antichrist, which is, you think, wild. But this is where you get to chapter 10, and this is important. Now, again, I'm not going to walk through all of it because I really am trying to end on time so that we have time for questions. But you read chapter 10, and there is this image where the angel kind of tells John, eat this scroll. It's going to be sweet in your mouth, but bitter in your stomach. So he eats it. It's sweet as honey, but in his stomach, it's bitter and, he has a boo-boo in his tummy kind of thing. So he doesn't feel good. But what's the imagery? And it's actually really important. The sweetness of the scroll is these things that have all happened, the seals, the trumpets, the judgments. There is a sense of rejoicing in the sense that God has fulfilled his promises. He's doing exactly what he promised to do. And to see God, you say that perfect justice being served, but you come right off the tail end of 9 where most of the world is still looking at God and saying, yeah, no, I'm going to keep doing what I want to do, even after everything that they've seen up till this point. It's sweet because God is fulfilling his promises, but it is bitter because it's hard to watch so many continue to reject God and what's going on. And then 11, and this is going to mark a transition. So this is kind of like it's going to seem like I'm going and then I'm going to stop because that's what I'm going to do. But chapter 11 is the ministry of the 2 witnesses. And I'm just going to give you an overview because I really want to get to that conclusion and just make sure we have time for questions. But just a description of as you walk through chapter 11, their ministry starts at the halfway point of the tribulation. It lasts 3.5 years, so that's going to push you right till the end. So that's where you see a little bit of a fast forward of the description. It does say that they are supernaturally protected by God. I actually put the 9:4 reference by the wrong point, so I apologize. That 9:4 is connected to their protection supernaturally by God. And that's, again, where he talks about the purpose of, well, anyways, I'm just going to keep going. And then they do preach the gospel. And what you note is there is a revival as you're reading through chapter 11. After they die and resurrect, there's a huge revival of people that do get saved. It references that as you're going. And the earthquake. It's verse, come on now. Verse 12, sorry. In the earthquake, 7,000 people were killed. And it says the rest were afraid and gave glory to the God of heaven. So that's the revival I'm talking about. And then it does say that they're murdered by the Antichrist, but they are ultimately resurrected by God. And they kind of are taken to heaven. And that is actually, so if you're going chronologically, you would jump from 11 to 16, because that's the bowl judgments, and that would get you to the end. And what we'll do next week, because at 12, 13, kind of 14, and as you get into 15, it kind of does a little bit of a rewind to go, now let me kind of explain what has been going on in the background with Satan, the Antichrist, and the false prophet. And then it just jumps right back into where this picked off. So that's where we're going to stop today, and I'm just going to do this, and then we'll open it up for questions. What's the so what of this tribulation period? Because there's a lot that's going on. Acts 1 and then Matthew 24, there is a point of nobody knows when this is going to happen. I even recently heard somebody talking, it was like a lesson through this, and he was talking about nobody knows, but then somehow through his lesson, he ended up making a prediction about when it's going to happen. And I was like, that intro didn't match conclusion. Nobody knows when this is going to happen. 2, Matthew 25, you see the references there. Don't look for signs. That's not the point, is to wait around, the rapture position or whatever. Like, we're not supposed to look for signs. It is actually supposed to be a motivation of, this is going to happen. Be faithful today. And this is where I'm going to go into 2 Peter 3, 10 to 18, this really beautiful premise of don't waste time, live for God now. Where Peter, talking about the future, he says, therefore, since all these things will be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness, looking for and hastening to the coming of the day of the Lord? He says the reality of these things happening is supposed to be a motivation for you to stop wasting time now. And I actually would even connect it to Bodhi's message a few weeks ago about that, like removing distractions, removing things. When you're thinking eternally, you're not going to waste the time that you're given now, but you're going to use it to live for God now and not waste it on things that aren't going to last. The guarantee of the future return of Christ, the judgment of God, is supposed to be a motivation and an encouragement to live faithfully today. And I just add that Deuteronomy 29:29, you have to be okay with having gaps in your knowledge. That's the secret things belong to God. We are not God, and so we are never going to know everything. I'm fully confident in saying that, okay? And I think especially with end times, you're going to have to be okay with that, with not having every little nook and cranny filled, because we're not given that information. We're just told, in a sense, God is fulfilling his promises, and this is going to happen, so don't waste time. And so next week, we'll kind of get more into the background. I don't know if anybody's got any questions. We do have time. I went 3 minutes over my planned stop time, but we're still okay. Any questions at all? I would love to hear any thoughts or inputs or whatever. Yeah, Shannon. Yeah, if you look at the way like the seventh seal initiates the 7 trumpets, and then when you get to the 7th trumpet, it initiates the 7 bowls. So that would be, it's sort of like their, I don't know, like the bar graph. I'm not going to click back that far. But yeah, they basically are contained within each other, but each one is kind of just moving through it. Yeah. Did you have hands? Yeah. No, yes, sorry. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's what, for me, going through this is such an encouragement. It's like just the sovereignty, like that he's in control the whole time and he knows what he's doing. And he is, like, that's where you see the fulfillment of promises. Like, he is working with purpose to an end that results with these fulfilled promises. But everything has its time, and it fits right where it needs to because he knows what he's doing. That's good. Okay. Anything else? Going once? Okay. The timeline that I showed, if you'd be interested in it, I know I just put it up and kind of kept going. I just connect with me and I can email it to you. If not, don't worry about it. But if you do have any questions that pop in your brain, let me know. Next week, we'll kind of dive more into, like we said, the Antichrist and some of what's going on there. And hopefully that will also give some clarity and encouragement and motivation, just like Peter says. Don't waste time, live for God now.